video is a short overview of the stream of feminism known as liberal feminism. Liberal feminism is a common Western discourse of feminism growing from the early small L liberal concepts of writers like Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill. That is, that the individual has a certain series of rights, that governments should not infringe upon those rights without good reason, and that all are equal, which expanded to include women through the work of people like Mary Wollstonecraft, John Stuart Mill, Helen Taylor Mill, and others. Writers include people like Betty Friedan, who wrote about the so-called feminine mystique in the 1950s, one of the early US writers on feminism, talking about what she called the problem with no name. That is, that women who had often had some level of occupation outside of the home during the Second World War were effectively stuffed back into the home, became housewives, and that for many women that was an unhappy existence. For others loved it, of course, but it was a great source of discontent in the early and the mid 20th century. And she was talking about how that wasn't a necessary requirement of being a woman in Western society. Others, such as Gloria Steinem, built upon these ideas of the rights of the individual. Steinem has also worked with radical feminists, but tends to be a very pragmatic feminist around changing law to promote the social position of women. Liberal feminism is very much concerned with ideas of rights and reducing disadvantage that comes from women being treated as less than men in existing Western-style liberal societies. That is, societies based on the ideas of the individualized human being who is a possessor of rights but is not part necessarily of a collective, that person will strive for their own interests and that their rights must be balanced against the rights of others. The ideas of liberal feminism are sometimes critiqued as failing to adequately address systemic gender structuring of even liberal systems themselves. Radical feminists and many postmodern feminists would make this critique, and that they represent, with their reliance on law and the willingness to work within current social structures, often, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, the interests of middle-class white women. Though this has been a very effective branch of feminism, working with, as I say, also some radical feminists in bringing about things such as sex discrimination laws. Generally, liberal feminists critique their own so-called small L liberalism, societies' disguised inequalities. They show how male voices have been taken as normative and dominated discourses of rights, and that the idea of spheres of privacy and public space were inequitable to women and resulted in disadvantage to women, putting them in the power of the men in the households. This area of feminism and this theory of feminism is very good at redressing substantive issues of inequality in law, bringing about things such as anti-discrimination laws, some work on domestic violence, things such as equal pay for equal work, etc. So it is a force in law which often works within the assumptions of our current structures of society, but often quite effectively. As I say, the critiques for liberal feminism in jurisprudence is that they may ignore law's blindness to the private sphere or choices about what is the subject of law. Sometimes they ignore issues of economic inequality of the private sphere. That's a particularly Marxist feminist critique of liberal feminism. They're concerned often about the public sphere, things such as workspaces, etc. is critiqued as leading to state paternalism rather than a change in the underlying structures of society. But again, that has, in some ways, they would argue back, created new normative role concerns about what is normal in workplaces. They don't look particularly at the idea of the state as an oppressor by its existence as a state. They do sometimes critique the claimed objectivity and rationality of law, but also lean upon it. So some particularly radical feminists would say that masks patriarchal interests in law. There's relatively little analysis of law as a power structure or a power generally in society beyond the idea of the inequality of men and women, and that has led to certain frameworks of law. Beyond that, there is the assumption that working within the current frameworks, you can redress those inequalities. There are critiques that they may entrench the male as normative. For example, anti-discrimination law looks at issues of, are women unequal to men? So what is the normative position? It is men's position. Are women treated worse than that? Which is said to embed men as normative and see women still as the other. And some argue that liberal feminist jurisprudence ignores women's gendered injuries and doesn't find names or spaces to discuss those. But then sometimes they do, such as the idea of sexual harassment, which became part of anti-discrimination law, and which really was not a concept as a wrong as such until the middle of the 20th century. But it did come out of work by radical feminists who do make this critique. So that's liberal feminism.